I'm going to talk about story worlds and groups using the work of Alan Palmer. So let's start by thinking about mental functioning. So narrative, according to Palmer, and this is a quote, narrative is the description of fictional mental functioning. So when we're reading fiction or even watching a play, we follow the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, desires of characters, their mental functions. Even when dealing with their actions, we attribute intentions, purposes, motives, reason behind these actions. Another quote, readers enter the story worlds of novels primarily by attempting to follow the workings of fictional minds. So let's talk about this term story worlds quickly here. And this is a term that literary critics sometimes use. Sometimes you'll see the term text worlds. But basically it's referring to the world that you have to enter and understand when you're engaging with fiction. So readers have to gain access to fictional story worlds in order to understand the narrative. You might think of the text as sort of instructions instructions to assemble the story world. Especially, I think this is true in fantasy and sci-fi, right? But also historical fiction and really just any fiction. There's a certain world that the characters inhabit, and as you're reading, you come to understand that world. You do need some knowledge of the real world and reality to do this, but you also use a lot of inference when you're reading. Another interesting thing, and I think this is true, we tend to assume realism unless we're instructed otherwise. If we're just given a text and have know nothing about it, we'll assume that it's realistic until we learn otherwise. Now, I think what often happens with books is we already know what genre we're in before we read it, or we can judge things by the cover. So we usually know when we're reading fantasy or science fiction beforehand, but not knowing anything, we tend to default to just realism. So theory of mind comes into play here. Theory of mind is basically just a term that refers to the way that we read and understand the minds of other people. So spaces, objects, events in a text are interpreted by readers as experiences of characters, right? So we understand the things that exist and the things that happen in a text through the minds of the characters in the story. And the story world will be experienced differently by different characters, different minds, because different characters have different knowledge levels, different values, different beliefs and opinions. A useful term is focalization, which just refers to the point of view you're given in a text. So, for example, in a first-person narrative, something like Scout and To Kill a Mockingbird, the focalization is on Scout throughout the text, basically. Some texts are close third person, where you get a focalization on one character throughout, even though it's in third person. A lot of texts jump around and change the focalization. Someone like Virginia Woolf does this a great deal, right? Where you're constantly jumping into different characters' minds. But focalization refers to the point of view that you're given, the mind that you're inside of. So Palmer is interested in intermental thought as opposed to intramental uh, in terms of literature. So intermental means, joint mentality, group mentality, shared experience, collective thinking, socially distributed, or sometimes called extended cognition, right? The way groups think, the way people think in groups, as opposed to intramental, which is internal, individual thought. He says only an intermental perspective will reveal that, for example, a town can have a mind or a group can have a mind, right? That a town can have a response to a character, that a character can have a response to the town, that we can think of minds collectively. So in these story worlds, we can think of groups as literally having minds. So with that in mind, we might think about unconscious thought, right? Psychologists have long recognized that people are often mistaken about the nature of their own mental functioning, right? That we understand consciously a lot of what's going on in our mind, but there's a lot of other stuff going on unconsciously. So for example, in a hypothetical situation, we often think in our conscious mind that we will act in one way, but when faced with the actual situation, we act differently, right? Maybe we think at work, if my boss gives me any trouble today, I'm really gonna let him have it. And then your boss comes along and gives you some flack, and you don't say anything, even though consciously you wanted to, but unconsciously there's someone in there saying, I really need this job. I can't give my boss a hard time, right? So we act differently than we think we're going to act sometimes. And this is because much of our decision making occurs unconsciously. Unconscious thought happens fast, unintentionally, uncontrollably, effortlessly. When we're judging people, for example, we'll often very quickly draw from familiar stereotypes, put people in categories to evaluate them. And once we have those, make those unconscious judgments, we often refuse to change our minds, even when we're given contrary evidence. So thinking about, a mind having a town having a mind, so to speak, and that we know minds tend to work unconsciously, does it make sense to think about the unconscious mind of a town? So Palmer gives us two concepts here. One is feeling rules, things you think you're supposed to feel based on conscious values and beliefs, right? That your society tells you you're supposed to think this way, so consciously you tend to think that way, but maybe not unconsciously. And then dual attitudes, what you really feel, often being in contrast to what you consciously value. So Palmer argues that groups can have unconscious conflicts within their social values. So a couple examples, if you look at a lot of Ibsen's early plays, you'll see this where there's a town that has some kind of like high moral standards, right? But little things come out and you start to see that, maybe even though the characters all reiterate these standards, that maybe they're not really that happy with them. Think about Footloose. Another example is To Kill a Mockingbird, going back to that. Uh, Everyone in the town is mad at Atticus Finch for defending Tom Robinson, or just about everyone in the town. Collectively, the town has decided that they don't like what he's doing. However, even after the trial, we find out that Atticus gets reelected by the town to his position, right? So even though they consciously, dislike him and are expressing disdain for him, there's also a level upon which they trust him to do his job and like him. So you can see how even a group mentality can show conflict, right? That unconscious things can come out in a group mentality. Interesting stuff here.